Got to resume recording. So we are recording this. So if the people that have registered and can't attend, you'll be able to catch this recording later. I'll go over that in just a second. Okay. So today is March 21st, and title of our webinar is Impacts of Fertilizer Ordinances on Water Quality in Florida Lakes. So we welcome Dr. Sam Smidt from UF, who's going to be our main presenter. Dr. AJ Reisinger is planning to be in attendance and can help with some additional questions if need be. And then take a look at our next two webinars. We are trying to round out the remainder of our schedule from June and through September, so watch for that. As Dr. Smidt continues starts his talk and continues, I will post the registration links for those last two talks. So just some, again, housekeeping. We ask that everybody mute their microphone, and also it helps with the bandwidth if your video is off during the presentation. You can also see in your upper right hand portion, you can see all the different view options there. You can see who's here. You can the chat is there for you to ask any questions at any time, but we won't get to the questions until at the end of Dr. Smith's talk. And then of course you've got the leave meeting button. We hope you don't leave, but please stay all the way to the end. And oh yeah, and I mentioned the view settings. So again, as I mentioned, this webinar is being recorded and will eventually be available online. We've been a little slow on getting these recordings up, and I apologize for that. Our former our webmaster, or in-house webmaster has moved on, so we're a little bit left in the lurch on that, and so I have to learn how to do all that, or what I'm hoping to do is just put these directly on our YouTube channel. And I'll see how well that gets, how well that works. And then if that works, Lisa and I will send you a link to that since we have all of your contact information. And then I'll hopefully be able to provide that link on our next webinar. Again, as I mentioned, please use the chat feature to ask questions anytime. Just remember, we won't be able to get to the questions until the end. So with that, I'd to introduce Dr. Samuel Smidt from he's an assistant professor of watershed sciences in the Department of Soil, Water, and Ecosystem Sciences at the University of Florida. Dr. Smidt is, did I just lose that? Sorry guys. Trying to get to his bioinformation. So he's an affiliate faculty of the School of Natural Resources and Environment, and is the principal investigator of the Land and Water Lab, where his group focuses on sustainable resources management. And the title of Dr. Smith's talk is Impacts of Residential Fertilizer Ordinances on Florida Lacustrine Water Quality. And with that, Dr. Smidt, I am going to turn, I'm going to stop sharing and turn hosting duties over to you, or sharing duties over to you.
Excellent. Thanks, Vincent. I'm going to share here. Okay, is everybody able to see this here?
Looks good on my end.
Excellent. Thumbs up from the crowd. We'll assume we're good here. All right. Okay, welcome. Thanks everybody for attending. My name is Sam Smidt. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Soil, Water, and Ecosystem Sciences. This is my 5th year at UF. And today I get to have the opportunity to speak with you about a paper that we recently published on the impacts of residential fertilizer ordinances on Florida lacustrine water quality. Just want to start out by defining some keywords here, or just setting the context. So in this case here, when we talk about fertilizer ordinances, we're specifically talking about the residential homeowner applications. We're not talking about industrial scale or agricultural fertilizers. We're talking specifically individual homeowners, or even professional landscape groups that do homeowner care. But if you see the picture here on the left, we have the fertilizer spreader. This is the kind of thing we're talking about. So fertilizer ordinances we'll define here in just a little bit, but ordinances meaning how they're regulated in terms of when you can and cannot apply. Lacustrine is another word that might be new to some of you. Lacustrine is a geology word or an earth science word. It just means relating to lakes. And in this case, lakes meaning freshwater inland. They can be of any size, but if you look here in the background, you'll see that there's those homes. Those homes have turf grass. Naturally, those homeowners are applying residential fertilizer to those landscapes, and it's connected directly to their local waterway. In this case, you have the stormwater pond. It can be natural, artificial lakes, but when we're talking about this idea of lacustrine impacts or water quality, we're talking about freshwater water quality impacts of local waterways in Florida. If you get into fertilizer BMPs, you'll hear the 3 R's a lot. The 3 R's, it's really a singular R, which is right. But here you have right rate, right place, right time. Rate, if you've ever used a fertilizer spreader, that green thing in the picture below, there'll be a dial, and that dial basically is a release that lets out a certain amount of fertilizer per spin of the spreader or the dial. But in this case, it's the application rate or the loading rate. Right place would mean that you're actually applying it to the turf grass. You're not applying it in the landscape. You're not applying it too close to a waterway. Right time in this case would be more of like a time of year. It could also be relative to the water conditions and precipitation patterns, things like that. And then there's actually a 4th R or a 4th right that's mostly goes understated, and that's right source. We don't typically talk about source is because mostly the fertilizers that landowners or homeowners are applying are going to be pre-packaged. So you just go to Lowe's or Home Depot and say, I have St. Augustine grass. Now you'll get this like Scott's Southern Lawn Food bag. You don't really have to worry about what's in it. You just know that it's right for your grass. But that fertilizer has some mix of ingredients that is going to be its source. Typically, it's an NPK ratio. There can be some other things in there. But that's all been basically dialed up for you. So it's not something that gets considered a lot by the average landowner or homeowner, but it is something to be considered when we're talking about fertilizer BMPs. Sorry, here we go. I want to point out, as you all are well aware, that there is a well-documented, but we can call it highly complicated relationship between nutrients and water quality. Florida is just loaded with nutrients, both naturally and artificially, and Florida is naturally connected to waterways. Florida has an abundant water resource, freshwater and marine. Everything's connected. What happens on the land makes its way to waterways. And so we're intimately connected between the landscape and the water. And so we want to really dial in the relationship between nutrients on the landscape and then overall water quality, especially as we start talking about things like algal blooms. You can even, you hear red tide a lot. Now we have this big seaweed mass that's coming towards Florida. There's lots of reasons why we consider water quality and what's going on in the water and how that impacts local residents. And so it's something that we're all passionate about and aware about. And so it isn't much of a stretch that we want to start protecting our waterways. And so this is an example of an Alachua County fertilizer ordinance marketing material. You go to Ace Hardware, Home Depot, Lowe's, really anywhere else that sells fertilizer, you're going to start seeing these signs. These signs advertise the local fertilizer ordinance. And what an ordinance does is it basically allocates a time period in which a homeowner is not allowed to apply fertilizer. There's a blackout period. In this marketing material or this poster, I've covered up that time in the red box. We're going to talk about that in a second. But in this case, this is Alachua County. It says the countywide water quality code prohibits the use of fertilizers containing nitrogen from this period to this period, which has been covered up. But directly below that, you see really the rationale or the motivation. It says what starts here on the left, which is that fertilizer spreader, can end up here on the right, which is local springs. Alachua County has a lot of freshwater springs. We're passionate about them. We want to protect them. And so naturally, we want to improve the water quality, or at least stop the degradation of our local waterways. And so these signs go out to say, hey, heads up, homeowners, we're not applying fertilizer from this time to this time because we think it's a good idea, ultimately to protect our waterways from nutrient loading related to the nutrients that are in that fertilizer. And it's not just Alachua County. Fertilizer ordinances are across the board in the state. I think at this point, more than half of the counties have now adopted them. It's not just specific to Florida either. You can see these across the country, especially along the East Coast. Most of them are going to be coastal ways. Massachusetts, for example, is one that has a lot of fertilizer ordinances. But if we get back to Florida, we can see that these started to show up in about 2000, and they've been increasing or appearing over time. This figure needs to be updated. I did this last in 2019. I believe since then there's at least 2 more to be added. Miami-Dade County in the Southeast is one example. They have since added one in 2021. And so these are still gaining momentum. They're still relevant. They're still popping up. And they're likely to continue into the future. Another thing to point out here is that most of these ordinances are showing up along the coast. The inland counties are a little bit later in that process, but they're likely to continue as we keep moving forward into time. Okay, so we kind of set the preface here. Ordinances are a blackout period. They ultimately are designed to stop the nutrient loading to local waterways, ultimately with the hope of improving local waters. So I wanted to do a quick, just self-paced here activity. I want you to imagine or envision that you're a local official and you're designing a fertilizer ordinance for your county or for your municipality. And you are trying to decide what time of year your ordinance should be in effect. This is that blackout period. So from what time to what time should your county or your residents not be applying residential fertilizer? So when is your blackout period? But then also why? Why are you picking that time? So for example, what month to what month? January to March, March to June, June to August, something like that. Just what is the time period and why? Think about it. Feel free to enter in the chat. I think I can see it. Give you a couple minutes here. Excellent. We have some coming in. March through September, wet season, May through November. May through September, July through February, because of wet season and then dormancy. May through September. Wait for a couple more if they exist. Feel free to put it into the chat. November through March. Never if you're irrigating with reused water. May through September. Excellent. All right. So we're starting to see some examples here. May through September is a common one. Or if we want to break this up into seasons, we can call that maybe like a summer ban or a summer fall ban. There's also some that have gone later into the year, maybe more into a winter ban. And so typically when we talk about fertilizer ordinances, they're often referred to as like a summer ban or a winter ban. Those are the two most common in Florida. I'll show you that here in a second. But really what it comes down to is going to be a wet and a dry season. And that's where these ordinances will come through, is a wet season ban or a dry season ban, which correlates to summer ban or a winter ban. So this is what it looks like in Florida as of 2019. Like I mentioned, there's a couple new ones. Miami-Dade, they just put in a summer ban. But if you look along the coast, on the southwest side and the eastern side, you're going to see those summer bans come through. Martin County here is a summer ban, varies by jurisdiction. What that means is that some of the cities within the county may operate a little bit differently. There's some other things like a non-seasonal ban might be a blackout period after a rain event or after, say, new turf grass has been installed, but it doesn't necessarily follow seasonally. But for the most part, what we see is the relationship, or the most common one, is it going to be the summer ban, which is going to be a wet season ban. There are some differences, like Alachua County, for example, has a winter ban. They've actually since updated. I can talk about that here in a second, but the summer ban is the one that is most common in the state of Florida. And this is where that rationale comes from. It's showed up in the chat a little bit, but the idea is that there's a popular sentiment that the rainy season washes away those nutrients and then via runoff takes those nutrients and puts them into the waterways. And so I mentioned Alachua County, this marketing material. You'll start to see these marketing materials come through, or different ways to establish rationale and motivation. And so here's just one example from Naples, what Florida's rainy season means for your lawn. This is how they were starting to preface their fertilizer ordinance. But like I mentioned, it's this idea of looking at rainy season and water washing away the fertilizer. And that's pretty well the overarching sentiment throughout most of the state. Mentioned Miami-Dade, they just put theirs in. So this is their marketing material. And I didn't make the distinction in Alachua counties, but if you remember, if you can recall, the fertilizer spreader on the left and the spring on the right, it says what starts here can end up here. And there's kind of that caveat of like, well, it doesn't always, or there's a possibility that it could, but maybe it doesn't. Miami-Dade doesn't add that qualifier, that can. They just say fertilizing your lawn adds pollution to the bay. It's not can adds pollution, it's just that it does. And they put in the summer ban, prohibited May 15th through October 31st. All right, and so you'll see these at every county. Again, the sentiment being that rain washes away that fertilizer and that it adds directly to nutrient loading. I wanted to point out this quote. This was something that came through in Miami-Dade County when they approved it. I thought it was an interesting quote, and so I've kept it. I've highlighted the important part in red, but it says, washed away by the rain, where deadly nutrients seep into the ground that will essentially poison the bay. That's why it's dangerous to be doing that during the rainy season. And those are really just strong words. And I think this is a really good lesson in science communication that we can talk about later if you'd like. But in this case, here you have the mechanism, which is washing away by the rain, the outcome, which is deadly nutrients seeping into groundwater and then poisoning the bay. And then here, that's why it's dangerous to be doing that during the rainy season. I don't know. Well, never mind. We'll just skip on from that. So keep that in mind. Anyways, going back to Alachua counties. So here that that red box is uncovered. I mentioned that Alachua County has more of this winter ban. It's really a fall winter ban. They have since updated theirs. It's now, I think, summer, fall, and winter. Spring is now the only time you can apply in Alachua County. But I want to get to the point where we start to question this idea of what starts here can end up here, or this idea that that's why it's dangerous to be doing that during the rainy season. or washed away by the rain, where deadly nutrients seep into the ground, water that will essentially poison the bay. It's the question of like, on what grounds are we making these statements? Because there isn't any evidence to suggest that these are like truths. Rationale would suggest that that's the case, and there's small studies here and there that help build up some dialogue, but there really hasn't been concrete or like clear scientific understanding of the relationship between these ordinances and their outcomes on water quality. So it's just really interesting that we talk about it this way when there really isn't demonstration or observable data to back up these claims. Some examples here, as you all aware, Lisa Krimsky, that's a name you should know. They came out with a study in 2021 that was looking, I can't remember the specific county. I want to say it was might be Manatee County or something like that. I can't recall. But in this case, they were looking at a summer band county, Brevard County, maybe the one that just came through in the chat. And so what they found here was that fertilizer ordinance in the summer did not have an outcome on nitrogen. And so they found, hey, the ordinance wasn't really working here. A study from 2014 came out showing human responses to Florida red ties, policy awareness, and adherence to local fertilizer ordinances. What this study was looking at, it was saying that we took some of our most well-aware residents and basically asked them, are you aware if your county has an ordinance? And they basically said no. And so maybe you're aware that your county has an ordinance and that's why you're here, or maybe you're not even aware and this is a surprise to you. And so even though a county has an ordinance, how is that being enforced? Do the residents actually know that it's happening? And so can we even say that the ordinance is effective if no one even knows that it exists? So there's a lot of uncertainty in the impacts of these ordinances. And so that's where this study came from. We wanted to know, what is the long-term water quality impact for Florida lakes? Long-term being a key here, and Florida also being a key. That's why I have them bolded. Long-term, most fertilizer ordinance studies happen on the order of like 1 to 3 years, which isn't really long enough to understand the relationship between ordinance impacts and long-term water quality, or just water quality in general, since some of these things take a while to build up in the environment. There's legacy impacts. So we wanted to extend that timeline as best we could. And then we also wanted to look specifically at the entire state of Florida. Again, most studies that are looking at fertilizer ordinances are focused on one municipality, one county, or one bay. It's not looking at the compilation of all of these to get a complete picture. And that's where Lake Watch comes in. Maybe you're aware of Lake Watch, maybe you're not, but there is a community science program in Florida where residents or community members can collect water samples, being trained by UF-IFAS and other personnel. And so what happens, there's new marketing material. I like these screen grabs, the one on the left compared to the one on the right. This is I forget exactly the year this picture on the left came out, but I want to say it's in the 80s or early 90s. And then on the right, this was the COVID era when they were starting to take these trainings and make them virtual. So now they're on YouTube and things like that. But what's happening in both of these cases is that you have an IFAS personnel that is out in the community, and they're teaching these participants or these volunteers, how do you properly collect a water sample? Once these water samples are collected, then they get shipped back to UF, where they get processed, and then they get stored into a data repository. And then that's the access that we had. We had access to that data repository. And so in our case, we had over 3 decades worth of data. We had over 4,000 sample points across over 160 lakes. We filtered a lot of the data to make sure that we could have a before and after period. So for example, we took a 5-year window before and after. So if an ordinance was put in 2015, that means we need to have data from 2010 to 2015 as the before period, and then 2015 to 2020 as the after period. And so we ultimately ended up with, after the filtering process, like I said, 4,000 samples across 160 lakes, across all of the ordinance types. And so here's the spread. You can see where we're at. We're basically cover the entirety of the state, and we've hit all of those different ordinance types. We ultimately then just use the mixed modeling method to look at the ordinance impacts. And we look specifically at total phosphorus, total nitrogen, chlorophyll A, and Secchi depth. Phosphorus and nitrogen are obviously going to be those nutrients that are directly in fertilizers. I mentioned NPK, N being nitrogen. And then we also have P and K, phosphorus, potassium. In this case, chlorophyll A is serving as a metric for algal activity. It's really just a biological indicator. And then Secchi depth is a measure, you can look at it in terms of water clarity. We won't necessarily get too much into this, but Secchi depth, you can look at it as it's a black and white disc that you drop down into the water and you basically measure the distance at which you no longer can see it. And so as there's suspended particles and things that get in the way, it basically in that water column between you and that disc, the clearer the water, the deeper you can see the disc. So this is what the modeling results look like. This is just one example, so we can talk through this. So on the y-axis here, you have that total phosphorus, and then on the x-axis, you have time. And then on the left is the before ordinance, and on the right is the after ordinance. So you can see before and after ban. And so what we're seeing here is that on the left side, before the ordinance, the trend is going up. So phosphorus, total phosphorus in the water is increasing over time. On the right-hand side, after the ban, you can see that that line starts to level out. So what we're seeing is an impact of the ordinance on the rate of increase of phosphorus in the waterways on the left. I do want to point out that in this case, it doesn't necessarily mean that an impact is an improvement in water quality. What it's showing is that an impact means that it's slowing the rate of increase or slowing the rate of degradation. It might still be degrading, it might still be getting worse or still loading phosphorus, let's say, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's happening at the same rate as it was before. So it's slowing down the rate of loading. It could be reversing it, it could be improving it, but in this case, what we're seeing is that there is just a change in the rate of loading before and after, and that's what we see. Another way to digest that is to look at the slope. The increased slope or the angle of the slope is greater on the left than the angle of the slope on the right. Okay, so I'm going to show you a table here. It's going to break it down by metric, water quality metric, nitrogen, phosphorus, chlorophyll, and Secchi depth, and then also by ordinance type. And this is going to basically be the main takeaways. So here you have, looking first at phosphorus, and I'll walk you through this table so we can digest it. So the rows here are going to be those fertilizer types, or sorry, those ordinance types. No ban, which would be no ordinance. Non-seasonal, which I mentioned is not specific to a time period, but more an action or after an event. Summer would be a wet season ban, winter would be a dry season ban. So what we're seeing here on, I also have this color coded. So if you see the orange color, that's showing ongoing degradation. Blue would be showing an improvement. And then gray would be showing a mixed result, or just it's not quite clear. And then also the level to which, or the intensity of the color also shows the effect size. So in this case, a darker blue is a larger effect, a greater effect. If you look into the numbers and the asterisks and things, that's just getting more into the specific statistical metrics, if you're into those. But you can just look at the color code and then the increase, small effect, decrease, small effect. So in this case, what we see is that total phosphorus has continued to increase in counties that have not adopted an ordinance. For those that have done a non-seasonal ordinance, there has been a slight decrease, a slight improvement in that rate of change. In the summer ordinance, there's been a medium effect in that rate of change. And then in winter, there's been a large effect in that rate of change. Does this make sense how we're digesting this? If not, hop in and throw something into the chat. I'm happy to keep breaking that down. But if we want to keep just looking at this more simply, what we're seeing is that ordinances did have an effect on phosphorus, with winter ordinances having the largest effect, followed by summer ordinances, followed by non-seasonal ordinances. So winter ordinances had the largest effect on slowing down the rate of increase of phosphorus. Okay, next up, nitrogen. Nitrogen in no-ban counties had no change. There was a slight improvement in those non-seasonal bands. Summer ban counties didn't see any change in nitrogen. And then winter bands showed the largest effect, or the largest change in rate of loading. Chlorophyll A, like I mentioned, this is that biological indicator. No changes for no-ban counties or non-seasonal ordinances. Summer bans, one statistical metric said there was no change, another said there might be some. And so this was kind of that mixed result, wasn't quite clear. And then winter bans came through with the largest effect. It did have a large effect on slowing down the rate of increase of chlorophyll A. Secchi depth, like I mentioned, was that measure of water clarity in this case. No-ban counties saw a slight increase or slight improvement. Non-seasonal ordinances, no change. Summer bans saw a medium effect, and winter bans saw a large effect. Are we clear on how to digest this table? If not, go ahead and ask them away. I think AJ is actively answering questions in the meantime too. I can take questions at the end as well. But if we look at this just collectively, we can see that non-seasonal ordinance, had some effect. Summer bans had some effect. Winter bans had the largest effect. And this is statewide across those 4,000 samples, 160 lakes. So getting into the takeaways here. Takeaway number one, it's important to point out that fertilizer ordinances do have a positive impact on water quality, but they don't have the same impact. There is a question of, do ordinances work or do they not work? In this case, what we're showing is that ordinances did have an impact. So that statistically has been resolved now, which is a really cool takeaway from this study. We can see that ordinances did have an impact. And you can see that here on the left, just for phosphorus. There was no impact, actually a continued degradation or ongoing degradation for those that had no ban counties. And then for non-seasonal summer or winter or just ordinances, saw improvement. I mentioned that there's studies that show that ordinances don't work. So Lisa Krimsky and her team found that summer ban county did not have an impact on nitrogen. This study can also be used to fill in kind of the gap between the studies that do say ordinances work and don't say ordinances work. And so in this case, take that paper, summer bans did not have an impact on nitrogen. Yes, we agree. You can also look at the papers that say, hey, ordinances do have an impact. Yes, we agree. And so this is I think another interesting takeaway is that this study can support both sides of that argument. And it helps to piece the pieces together. Takeaway number 3 in this case, the sentiment that rain washes away fertilizer, I don't think that is going to come through as being the most accurate way to look at things. Another way to phrase that here is, in this case, what Florida's rainy season means for your lawn. So here you have, what does water do to the landscape? I think it actually needs to flip. Now it's, what does landscape mean for the water? Not necessarily precipitation, but necessarily maybe more for the downstream impacts. And so I think this relationship needs to get analyzed a little bit more. And I think we need to dive in a little bit more into that type of sentiment. Another takeaway here, I think it's important to point out that residential fertilizer does have an observable signal in the landscape. We did find that ordinances did have a statistical change, which means that there is enough of a footprint in the landscape that some policy or behavioral change was observable in the data, which means there's enough signal of residential fertilizer ordinances in the landscape that there is the opportunity to improve. Does that make sense? So there is a signal, and residential fertilizer is in the environment. That's not to say that it's more or less than other types. take agricultural fertilizers, for example, but the idea is statistically, there is a signal that can be observed. The last takeaway here, or sorry, I got one more. Takeaway number 5 here is there's just so much more to consider. And in this case, this is just a general figure. It's not accurate, but it's just used conceptually here. Florida has largely warm season grasses, Bermuda grass, St. Augustine grass, zoysia grass. So in this case, if you look at the BMPs for nutrient uptake for warm season grasses, they're taking up nutrients in spring and the summer. Wet season ordinances cut off that period of peak uptake. So there is a question of what does that actually do to the landscape, the overall quality of the landscape. There also is questions about like, how can we dial into this? When do we make the blackout period so that we can optimize the overall health of our landscape? And I don't think we're there yet on understanding either things. The fertilizer uptake, nutrient uptake for the vegetation. What does that mean for blackout periods? How does that relate to precipitation? We have to keep at this thing. There's enough merit here to show that ordinances are impactful, but we just don't know enough yet. We got to keep working on them. And then takeaway number 6, sorry, it says number 5, that needs to be updated. Community science does have real impacts here. This study could not have happened had it not been for the thousands of volunteers that have contributed to the Lake Watch database since 1986. This has been truly a statewide effort. All our team did at the end was just analyze the efforts of, thousands of volunteers. And so community science can actually have meaningful impact for the state and beyond. And I think that's just a really important takeaway here. So questions for you going forward is just, what do we do with this? Here's the state of where we're at with our ordinance design. Most of those are going to be summer bans. You can see where the winter bans came through. I'm happy to talk about more of the ins and outs of why I think the data showed the way that it did. But just what do we do with this information now that it exists? And then also, how do we communicate that? I think that's important on the right-hand side. I mentioned this marketing material a lot, but I think it's important to be able to carry this message well. And so how do we do that? And are we doing that effectively already? And then lastly, just some acknowledgements here. If you want to see the paper, this is the full one. It's in this Limnology and Oceanography Letters journal, L&O Letters. But really wanted to shout out to the team, Diego Aviles. He was an undergraduate in my lab at the time. He did a lot of the database organization, which was just an all-star project as an undergraduate. He's now working as an engineer. Faye Belsheed is the one that did the modeling. And so big acknowledgements to her, big thanks to her in getting all of those, building out that table, building out the modeling results. And then AJ's going to be your go-to guy for this. He's our extension extraordinaire and urban streams guy, stormwater ponds guy. He actually just got a big NSF grant to look more into this kind of thing, as well as some other things as well. But if you're interested in urban hydrology and local impacts, ecological land impacts, talk to AJ. AJ also helped oversee this work, helped draft the manuscript and everything from there too. Okay, that's all that I have. Thanks for having me today. I'm happy to answer questions if they come up. I think AJ may have been answering some in the chat. I'm not sure if they've all been resolved, but thanks for listening.
Cool. Thank you, Dr. Smidt. We do have some questions in the chat. Dr. Reisinger did answer one of them. I'll go ahead and just go through them. The first question I see is, did the winter ban counties also have a summer ban or only winter bans? And Dr. Reisinger answered that, only winter bans, and then mentions that Alachua County was the first to enact a dual summer winter ban, but it happened after your data analysis ended. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. So Alachua County added that summer ban or that dual ban after the analysis. So that would not have been picked up in this study. That would make for a really, interesting follow-up study. Yeah, great. Let's see. Sonia Swearingen asks, since winter bans have the biggest impact, does that mean there are no restrictions on other seasons? How is that measured? So does that mean that
And
there
you
are
can
no
see-
ordinances. Does that mean restrictions in terms of ordinances? So for winter ban counties, are they only prohibiting winter applications? Is that how we're interpreting that?
Yeah, I
Doc-
think so. I think so,
Okay.
Sam.
Yep. So I think that goes back to the other one. And for the counties that we analyzed, and if you go back, there's only the three, 1, 2, 3. And if you actually go back to this, if we really want to get into it, these counties that had the winter bans on the nature coast here, they didn't have the data that made it through the filtering process. So the winter results are only going to be actually from Alachua County, which actually, I mean, that's a pretty interesting distinction here. It's something that, you know, needs to be talked about if we're actually really getting into the results of this study. And so in this case, at the time that we did this analysis, Alachua County only had the winter ban, which means you could apply freely any other time of the year. And you actually can go back, and it was, if you want to know the specific time, sorry, flipping through really fast, July through February. So in Alachua County, you're not supposed to apply July through February. The follow-up question though, or, you know, like the natural question is, who enforces this? Has anyone ever heard of anyone getting busted or fertilizing in this blackout period? Who would enforce that? And so this is really just more of like an honor system kind of thing. I've never heard of anyone actually getting in trouble for this, which is also just another really interesting takeaway, because even though it's just honor system, there still was an outcome, and statistically significant outcome. And so just from the peer pressure, or just from good behavior, we still are seeing positive outcomes, which is something else to point out.
Oh, great. Thanks, Dr. Smidt. The next question is, did you track precipitation during the summer?
Okay, so precipitation was not something that was actually included in the modeling results. One of the things that there's a lot of complexity that goes into the relationship. So one example would be, hey, was this lake a local stormwater pond, or was a larger was it a larger natural lake? Like the size of the lake would have an outcome. The amount of precipitation would have an outcome. The density of the homes would have an outcome. There's lots of external variables that would have influence on the outcome of this study. We don't have the ability, or didn't have the ability, to include all of those. And so the way that the modeling works is that there's this random errors term that basically says everything else gets grouped in here. All these externalities that we can't actually accomplish or account for get grouped in as this variable. And so even though that's the simplified approach, what we're doing is we're still addressing those things. We're basically giving the model room for error, but we're still seeing statistically positive outcomes. So no, we did not have precipitation in there, but that would be a really interesting follow-up site-specific study to say, you know, what is the relationship between precipitation and water quality outcomes?
Great, thanks. Okay, next question that I see is, did you look at spatial impacts? Were there any trends that certain areas, counties of the state saw larger improvements?
The first half of that question would go back to the answer on the other question. The second half of, were there some that had larger impacts than others? I haven't looked at them individually. I believe we would have those data. We've been grouping them together into those categories, but I haven't actually gone by one to say this one performed stronger than another. We should have access to those. I haven't looked at them.
Okay. Next question I see here, from Casey, was adjacent agricultural fertilizer application / timing considered?
Sorry, can you say that again? I'm trying to look.
I'm sorry. Was adjacent agricultural fertilizer application / timing considered?
So in this case, I would go back again to that answer of no, that would be an externality that would have been accounted for in the model, but not in a way that was directly included in a way that we feasibly could address. Especially, I mean, if you think about what we were doing, we were going back, you know, to the 80s, so 3-4 decades worth of data. And we wouldn't at the entirety, at the entire state scale, we wouldn't have agricultural records or fertilizer records for all of those in a way that would even be reasonable to analyze here. So that is something that, again, like going back to that takeaway number 5 of there's being more to consider, that's something that would that would have an influence and would be worth pursuing. And it's one of many other things to consider. And so there's more to keep going.
Great. And Dr. Reisinger also addressed that in the chat as well. Sorry, I just saw that. And as you saw, I just threw up our poll evaluation poll. So I'll keep that up for a little bit, but please answer that if you can. Okay, here is the next question that I see from Raquel. What are the benefits of a non-seasonal ban?
Benefits in terms of water quality benefits, or benefits in terms of why would somebody put that in? Why would a county elect a non-seasonal ban instead of something else?
And Raquel, feel free to unmute yourself if you want to, if you want to clarify that.
I can take a stab at it regardless. All right, so I'll assume in this case, it's why would somebody use a non-seasonal ban? Yep, want to set instead of another type of ban.
Okay.
I haven't personally talked to the decision makers in that. I can only speculate on why I would do that. And typically, when you think about the non-seasonal bans, it's going to be plus or minus, so many days of a storm event, or plus or minus so many days of new turf installation. And so what they're trying to do is, without being restrictive to landowners, they're trying to better tailor into best management practices of fertilizer ordinances. And so they set different windows of time as potentially a way to give freedom to the landowner while still trying to capture environmental benefits. Would be my personal opinion on that answer.
Okay, great, thank you. And then I know you had addressed this, but I'll go ahead and read it. Is how good is the enforcement / compliance with the ban? I'm assuming any county that has a ban.
Yep.
Yeah.
It looks like Brandon Smith, I'm sorry, I don't know everybody personally here, may have been able to comment on that better than me. I have never heard of anybody getting in trouble for being out of compliance here. So I don't know anything about enforcement or compliance, but I think that would be a better question for the audience here, since that would be more in your day-to-day activities.
Yeah, particularly if any of the professionals on this call has had any experience with that or have heard of that. And I'll look for the chat for that if it gets in there. And then oh, okay. Dr. Reisinger asked Brandon, if the complaints are primarily homeowners or professionals. Let me see. Brandon, you can, if you want to, feel free to unmute yourself or go ahead and type that in the chat. Okay, the answer that he's put there is the ones that he's seen have mainly been homeowners. And the ones he's heard about professionals were applying other lawn treatments other than fertilizer during the ban. So I guess somewhat related practices, but not specifically related to a fertilizer ban. And okay, and then Sonia asked if the bans are apply to everyone, including agriculture, and Dr. Reisinger answered that, and they are really just for residential landscapes.
Mm-hmm.
And they are adhered to by my assumption is they are adhered to by municipalities as well, right? In their in their areas. Is that correct? Whether it's a park or medians or things like that. Is that, do you know about that?
That's a good question. Maybe Dr. Reisinger or somebody else can answer that question. I don't know if I've heard it ever phrased that way.
Mhm.
I would imagine that those kind of common use areas are not included in the ordinances officially,
Mhm.
but like if it's county or municipal managed, they're often not fertilizing at the same level as a homeowner anyway, because they don't care as much about how green the lawn is in the median, right? They're
Mhm.
like wildflowers or weeds or something like that. That might differ between communities. Some might have more of a concern with the aesthetics of their common areas. And there's also like common areas that are near stormwater ponds are subject to other regulations based on like not fertilizing within a certain buffer zone of a pond. So there are other regulations that can come to play as well.
Okay, great. Thank you. Cool. Well, any more questions? This is great. Thank you so much, Dr. Smidt. This is really, really interesting. And the one, somebody joined a little late. So can you get into what you think the mechanism driving this with winter versus summer?
Sure. Yep.
Yeah.
Let me share my screen again. I'm not going to share the presentation, but I think you can see my slides here.
Mhm.
So I posed this question to you here. Like what do we do? And so here's what we have set up in the state. And here's basically our plan of attack, which is we're going to put an ordinance on the books, and then we're going to just post marketing material everywhere. We have some enforcement, but we're not quite clear, on how aggressive that is across the state. But then you also have this table, and this table is, the summary table here. And so what we hear often in response to this table is everybody should just adopt a winter ordinance. It's like, if winter is the one that performs the best, why don't we just do that? Right. Well, then you got to go back to this slide, which I was kind of hinting at before. And it's, well, if you look deeply into this, Alachua County is the only one that had reported winter date. And so you wouldn't actually set up a scenario, a statewide plan based on Alachua County, right? For several reasons. One is just scientifically, that's not a good plan. But also two, environmentally, Alachua County operates differently than Martin County or Miami-Dade County, right? We go from subtropical down to tropical. Today, for example, when I woke up, there was frost on the roof of my house. And there was frost there yesterday too. And the grass is still relatively dormant and it turns brown. I have zoysia grass in my lawn. That's not the case down here in South Florida. And so what we think is happening and why this is such a strong signal is going back to the kind of this example. I threw this up. I just threw it as an example. I don't think it's scientifically accurate, but maybe it is. I don't know. But if you look at the idea, this green curve and this idea of warm season grasses, everywhere in Florida pretty much has warm season grasses, which means they are most active during the wet season and less active during the dry season. So what was done in Alachua County is they basically said, we'll give turf grass the nutrients when they need the nutrients, when they're taking up the nutrients, and we won't apply it when they don't. So in Alachua County, if we were to do, say, a summer ban, which is this gray box, we're cutting off the nutrients when the turf grass needs the nutrients, and we're applying it when the grass is brown and not taking it up. So we're just loading it into the environment and it's not doing anything. And so I think there's probably some relationship between the activity of the landscape and relative to the application, or in this case, it's going to be relative to the nutrient uptake. So when is it applied and when is it taken up? I think that that's a better sentiment to pursue than rain washes away fertilizer. I think we need to think more about the landscape and think more specifically about when is it being consumed by the landscape. So rather than rain washes away fertilizer, it's don't give your plants food when they don't need it, something like that. Does that make sense? And so I think there's more to be looked into if you take, rather than the water centric view, and you switch it to a landscape centric view. That's just my personal opinion. Maybe others would disagree or agree. I don't know.
Great. So more research.
Yeah.
But also, that gets into like knowing the growth rates of say St. Augustine across a latitudinal gradient. So
Yep.
So Raquel has one last question here, and thank you everybody for sticking on. We do have just a few more minutes, but thinking this might be the last question. What do you think about setting bands according to hardiness zones instead of per county?
Yeah, so Florida is a really interesting state because it's a vertical gradient. It's not a horizontal gradient. If you take like Nebraska, for example, that's an east to west state. Florida is a north to south state. And so hardiness zones, when you look at the hardiness map, you see zone 8B, 9A, 9B, and you get all the way down in 10 and 11. And so you could envision a similar map for ordinance date just by time, right? It's like based on temperatures and things, which is what the hardiness is set at, minimum temperatures. So I think that it would be, it makes sense to throw that out as an idea, to say, where are you at latitudinally, and how does that relate to this idea of peak uptake for our warm season grasses? I think that there's obviously going to be a lot more complexity and things like that, but I think that's a decent place to start, just in terms of conversation.
No, that's great. And our strains of grass, developed for those hardiness zones? Is that something they? We probably have turf.
I don't know how to answer that one
Yeah.
correctly. I don't know if they're developed specifically for that hardiness zone. It's more a matter of that they exist in that hardiness zone. And that's the idea of the warm season grasses and things. Like, you're not gonna, you really get into the freezing temperatures, right? Like Alachua County is going to fall below freezing, which means certain grasses have to be able to acclimate and accommodate freezing temperatures. It also has to do with dormancy. If it stays above freezing, maybe they don't ever go dormant, right? They stay active. And so even if it can tolerate, maybe it stays active or productive year round, versus like zoysia grass in Alachua County, which takes a break for a little bit. So I don't know how to answer. I'm not a turf grass expert. I don't know how to answer that question properly.
Yeah, no problem. Well, we've got a few more minutes left. If anybody has any last minute questions, but yeah, this was fantastic. And thank you again, Dr. Smidt, for agreeing to present in our webinar series. And for those of you still on, if you have, I posted it earlier in the chat. If you are FNGLA members, please email me regarding the CEUs. I'll try to get those out to you as soon as I can. It more than likely will be next week. And thank you, Dr. Reitzinger, as well, for staying on to help answer questions. And he posts his email address in the chat as well. So, Lisa and I can provide that to you. So, and anyway, with that, thank you so much. And thanks everybody for attending and for filling out the poll. And look forward to seeing you on April 18th, where Dr. Tawfiq Reza is going to talk about some beneficial uses of sargassum that he's working on. That's been in the news a lot in the last few weeks. So I anticipate that will be quite interesting and popular as well. All right. Well, thanks everybody. See you next time. See you next month.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Sam. Appreciate it. And Sam, if you we'll get these poll results, probably Lisa will pull them, and then we'll provide those to you if you would like them.
Excellent. Thank you.
Perfect. Awesome. Yeah, that was great. That was really great. really appreciate that. So,
Thanks. Yep.
All right.
Appreciate the invite. We'll see you.
yeah. All right. I'll see you. Take care. All right. Bye, everybody. I'm going to go ahead and end the meeting. And then remember to email me if you are looking for CEUs. Thanks.